Okay, so it's one tick after the half hour, and we will get started. Hello, everybody, again. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this Global Leadership webinar series, part of our Global Wisdom webinar series. And this is the first of a series of 4 Global Leadership webinars that we're going to be conducting. We're very excited about introducing this to our learning model. We really believe very strongly that global leadership, just like culture, is learnable, and it's a really important skill for all of us to have. As, by the way, is witnessed by the fact that there are over 2,000 Culture Wizard users signed up and attending these webinars. So with that, let's get underway. I want to introduce who's here. The old guy on the upper left is me. I'm Michael Schell. I'm the CEO of RW3. And next to me on the left is Charlene Solomon, who is the president. And below us is Sean DeBerk, who is our director of learning. We're all going to be on this call with you. And while I'll be doing most of the talking, you'll be hearing from Charlene and Sean periodically to embellish information, pose questions, and make sure that we're staying on target and on track. Before we begin, there's an important aspect of leadership that I think needs to be clarified at the outset. In today's world, leadership is your choice. It's not just your title. The notion that you have to be a born leader is just not true. Of course, some people are born with more innate skills in certain areas. But we believe and will demonstrate that leadership is a learnable skill, and we think the organizations need it, and you need it, and we want to try to help you get it. The fact is that you don't need to be, and you shouldn't wait to be identified as a leader in your organizations. You can rise to that position on your own. In today's world, your organizations, all of our organizations, need leaders at every level of the organization. And I'll talk a lot about why that's the case as we go along through the program. And there's one other important point that I want to make. Leadership is a lifelong pursuit. Global leaders are constantly learning, are constantly growing, and it's a skill and a process that we get better at, and it always remains an exciting, wonderful learning experience. So wherever you are in the spectrum of leadership, there's going to be lessons here that are going to be valuable for everybody. Just as a little background about who we are, you all know because almost everybody here is a Culture Wizard user. We're the people who provide you the Culture Wizard site. We've been involved in teaching culture for over 40 years, and we are bringing that wisdom to over 100 of our global client organizations. Before we begin, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping items. It's good to keep a piece of paper or pad of paper near you to make some notes in general, but there's a point in this conversation that I will suggest that you write some things on that paper because it'll be good for you to save that as we go along through the process. The other thing I want to point out is that this is the first in a series of developing global leadership skills, and we'll look for further comments and as we about when the next session is, and I'll bring up a slide about that in a minute. There is a white paper on global leadership that's now available on your Culture Wizard sites, and I would encourage you to go there and get it. And a recording of our session will also be available on your Culture Wizard sites within a week. Sean, Charlene, anything that we need to add to the housekeeping?
I think that's good.
Great. I also wanted you all to hear the voice so you know when Charlene is speaking and when I'm speaking. Great. Okay. So let me just point out that this introductory session is the first one that we're in. The culture model that we're going to introduce has 3 parts. Authenticity, which is a session that we're going to go into in detail in March. Global mindset, which is a session we'll go into in July. and building trust and collaboration. So we'll talk more about those sessions as they come along. The agenda for today is to discuss why global leadership is important. So to set the stage, sort of, to speak, and to tell you why we're all here and why we're doing this and why 2,000 of your colleagues also thought it was really important. We're going to introduce the new learning model on global leadership that we're talking about. And we're really excited about introducing that because, to our knowledge, it's the first time that an effort is made to make global leadership a learnable skill. We're going to discuss the 3 components of global leadership that you've gotten a peek at before. And we're going to focus a little bit on how you can use this information to gain greater insight into your own leadership style. So let's begin with why global leadership is important. Look, it's important because it's a business necessity today. A McKinsey study conducted last year indicated that 30% of U.S. companies fail to exploit international business opportunities because they don't have enough leadership capabilities in the organization. But more importantly, what we've discovered in research is that organizations that have effective global leadership development programs are 4 times as likely to be market leaders, to excel in terms of revenue, profit, and market share as companies that don't have effective programs. That's a pretty powerful statistic. And even though we recognize how important global leadership is and how it's grown from 31 to 44% in the last 5 years, it still is only 44%. And when you think about this being such a valuable skill to gain, we'd hope that more than 44%, and I assure you when we do this program next year, there will be more than 44% of the organizations having global leadership development programs. And although we know how important this program is, only 21% of HR people said that their GLD programs were fully effective and efficient. So we've got a long way to grow and to go in the global leadership development, skill building within our organizations. There are 2 other points that I'd like to point out about why this is important. In a survey, another survey that was conducted, only 38% of leaders reported that they were satisfied with the quality of leadership in their organization. And only 18% of HR professionals surveyed indicated there was an adequate bench strength to meet future business needs. So with that, it's pretty obvious that this is an important skill to be gaining and to be building, and we want to do our part in helping share that. So why are global leadership skills so critical? Look, in today's world, we live in a knowledge-based environment. Most of our work requires our thinking, our contributing, our best intellectual capabilities. It's much more the thinking power than the physical power that we're presenting to our companies. And in a knowledge-based environment, leading thought is much more important than managing process. And we'll talk a little bit about that. On top of that, countries have different expectations and cultures have different expectations of what leadership is and what it looks like. But the role of leadership today is to maximize the intellectual contribution, facilitate it, make it easy for great people to contribute great thoughts, and make people comfortable in contributing their maximum contribution or the maximum value to the organization. The ability to make that happen, we say, is learnable. So let me introduce you to the model we use to teach global leadership. You'll notice that the model is based around a set of gears. And the reason that in designing this imagery for the model, we thought about gears because gears are interrelated, interdependent to make the entire machine move. And every gear has to work and has to turn to make the machine move. So these are basically the 4 gears that drive global leadership in our opinion. And we're going to set about to teach each of those 4 skills. Before we get into those, one of the things that we talk about is operationalizing global talents, and that's what we're doing. But in so doing, we presume a basic functional competency on everybody's part. It means that you know what your job is. You know, if you're an accountant, you know how to do accounting, and if you're an HR person, you know the HR functions. We're not teaching functions. We're not teaching roles. You know that. And we're also not defining the appropriate leadership personality traits that it takes to be a leader in your organizations. Those are things that are covered by the company in its employment practices and in its promotional practices. So we're not talking about that. But we are talking about, we will base this on certain personality traits. I don't want to leave the subject of personality traits without pointing out that Jim Rohn, who's an effective speaker and thought leader in this area, mentions these 7 personality traits as being important. So while I say we're not going to be teaching them, I think it's important to note them. He says that leaders need to be strong and not rude, kind without being weak, bold without being bullies, humble without being timid, and so on. On point 6, he talks about displaying humor without folly, which is true. Whenever I come across humor, though, in the international arena, I just need to remind everybody that jokes and humor is really not culturally transferable. So be careful about how you use humor, but it's important to have a sense of humor to yourselves. Okay, with that, let's dive into the model itself. So the first part of the model talks about authenticity and self-awareness. And we're going to talk about why that is the fundamental key to global leadership. And you'll hear this from me several times and examples of why it is and how it gets to be that way. The second gear in the global leadership model is a global mindset. And clearly, understanding the impact of culture, and we'll talk a lot about that, and how it impacts global leadership. Third, we'll talk about how you build trust using your authenticity and global mindset, how you build trust and enable collaboration, which is, of course, where the rubber meets the road for global leaders. We're not today going to talk so much about what leaders do, but more about who leaders are. By the way, just before I go into this authenticity and self-awareness series of slides, I want to remind you that there is a chat box on your screen, questions box, and you can feel free to pose questions. Sean, Charlene, and Paul Bailey in London are standing by to respond to some of those, and maybe if they and bring them out loud to my attention, so we'll try to respond to them publicly. So feel free to enter any questions that you have. Okay, so let's get into the whole subject of authenticity and self-awareness. What is it, and why is it important? So based on lots and lots of research in the field, the only universal criteria for effective global leaders was authenticity. And we're going to talk, again, more deeply about that. And why is that? Because authenticity is transparent. No matter what culture you come from, people can see if you're a real person, if you are who you say you are, and if you walk the walk, if you walk your own walk and talk your talk. Authenticity enables trust to develop. And trust, of course, as you know, is the foundation of management and relationship. The other point, which is really important in today's world, where you think about needing leadership at all levels of the organization, authentic leaders enable people who are their followers to also become authentic leaders. They create that kind of encouragement. And they encourage followers to contribute their best work. They enable followers to contribute their best work. On the word, I just want to take a moment and talk about the word followers with you. It may not be a word we use very often, but I've chosen to use it here particularly because it helps define the responsibilities of leadership. if you're a leader, members of your team look to you to be a leader, and they are in fact followers, although they may not like to be identified as that. But I think that it underscores the importance and responsibility of leadership. So further on the subject of authenticity, there's a scholar, Bill George at Harvard, who's written a great deal about this, and I'll refer to him several times during our session today. He cites over 1,000 studies of great leaders that have been conducted, and he indicates that there's not a single model of great leadership. That's very powerful, that there's not one single model, but he has found a universal similarity, and that is self-awareness. Further to that, Harvard Business Review recently conducted a survey of 125 leaders of all ages, and they also found that there was no universal similarity, except that what they did find is that there was one thing that was pretty much the same in all of them. They were self-aware. And that becomes then one of the founding principles of authentic leadership. Clearly, you can't be authentic by emulating others. And also, to me, pretty obviously, people trust you when you're yourself, and leaders must be trusted.
Mike, we have a question here on organizational structure and how important that is in adopting global leadership. Should it be irrelevant?
Organizational structure is very important, but it is really irrelevant to what we're trying to define now. Because unless you're in a repressive organization, which is hardly any successful business today, the ability to develop leadership skills in yourself is irrespective of the organization that you work with.
Okay.
So let's continue then. Thank you for that question. So self-awareness is the common denominator of authentic leadership, and let's take a look at what self-awareness is. Simply said, in order to be an effective leader, you need to be aware of how your followers need to be led. You can't lead people the way you might want to be led. You've got to lead people the way they need to be led. And this is where culture and global mindset come into play, and we'll talk about that more later on. You need to be aware of how followers see you. Think about how you are seen by others and how you are perceived by others. There are so many stories that I come across about leaders who are feared by people, and they not getting told the truth in terms of what's going on because people see them as not being open to dialogue and conversation. And what that, of course, does is when the leader discovers that, he realizes how much he's in his own way as a leader. And also, you need to be clear enough about who you are so you're comfortable to present a clear and consistent message, because in the final analysis, that's what people are expecting. And so in order to do all those things, you need this self-awareness. Who are you? How are you seen in the world? In order to help people develop the self-awareness skill, and we're going to do a lot of work on this in the first session we conduct on this in March on authenticity, we developed a self-awareness development cycle. And it starts by a person reflecting on his own or her own life story and the influences that made you who you are. Because those are the influences that created your values, that created your likes and dislikes. Of course, they're very culturally structured, which is why global leadership is so intertwined with global mindset. But when you have a kind of a life map and you look at what your life story looks like, you get to a better position to be comfortable with who you are, and you know why you like the behaviors you like and why you don't like others. You become to a position to be genuine, comfortable with yourself, And then you could be an authentic leader and seen as an authentic leader by other people. So this is not an easy task. It's really hard for us to look at ourselves. It takes time, it takes commitment, it takes perseverance, but it is a terrific thing for everybody to do for themselves, especially to get the sense of their own authenticity. So here's what the self-awareness cycle looks like. Of course, it begins with that, and you identify your life story, and we're going to talk about some tools that help you identify a life story. The life story then helps you identify your own values, where they've come from, how they were evolved, how they were reinforced by the activities in your life, the places that they worked for you, and why other behaviors might have failed you. You get a sense of why you are the way you are. Reflecting on those values and examining those behaviors puts you in a position to be much more sympathetic to yourself and to the behavior of others. And thus you gain authenticity, but you gain authenticity only to start the cycle again and continue to look and understand your behaviors, your values based on your own life story. So authenticity results when your actions genuinely reflect your values.
Mike, we have a couple of questions about authenticity, and it can be summed up with how do you manage, or how do you balance being authentic with being adaptable in a global arena?
That's a great question. Authentic means that you are comfortable with who you are, you're clear about your values, you're clear about your beliefs, you're clear about the things you hold dear, and you're comfortable enough to expose them and discuss those with people who have different values and come to a method of working effectively together without impinging on them.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, so we talked about this creating your life story, and there are life maps that enable that to be created. The one on the right is from Bill George's book, True North, and if you have an opportunity and if you'd like to read or download onto your Kindle, it's a great idea to look at his work because it's really eye-opening. But he creates this kind of an interesting path, which is your life path, and talks about and helps you design a way to create a life story. But there are lots of other sample life maps. I understand Oprah Winfrey. I looked online for different life maps, and I found that Oprah has one too. So it's not an uncommon thing to do, but it helps get a great sense of who you are and where your values come from. The items on your life map would include things from where you grew up, where your parents came from, where you went to school, what your school experiences were like, what the traumas in your life were like, what the passions in your life come from, what things you love to do and what things you hated to do. It talks about your marriage, your job, the experiences that you've had that have been terrific, what you've learned from being a spouse or a parent, places we visited, countries we lived in, religion, and cycles back around to all those subjects and how they impacted you and your intrinsic value systems. So let me pause for a moment and ask you to reflect on that white paper, the piece of paper next to you, is to ask you to write down the name or names of a person or persons who influenced your life. Think about them and what you admired about them. And they could be from the business world or from the personal related, from your personal stuff, from the communities, sports, coaches, political leaders. Think about what you learned from them for a moment here and write them down. Now, in these kind of webinars, it's hard to stop and have long moments of silence. But when you have some thoughts on that, why don't you write what leadership trait that influenced you, that you learned from them, how it contributed to influence you, and write that in the chat box. And let me see, we'll share what it was that you admired from other folks.
We're already getting a lot of them in. Persistence, integrity, led by example, conviction, honesty, accountability, persistence, trust. There you go. Individual thinker, fearless, cool under pressure, honesty, respect, fairness, compassionate. We have compassionate several times. We've had charismatic several times. Dignity, honor, and respect. Thinking critically, love, simplicity, empathy.
Wow.
Let's go on.
Wow, those are wonderful, everybody. I mean, those really are, when you think about that. So that's what influenced most of you about leadership, about the people that you've admired. Think about how you integrate that into your life map and how important that the authenticity of those people must have been for them to impress you that way. I mentioned to you that I'm struck by the works of Bill George. He identified 5 characteristics of authentic leaders, and I think it bears kind of pointing them out over here, is that authentic leaders, he says, understand their purpose, display strong values, establish trusting the relationships, are self-disciplined, and have a sense of mission acting from the heart. I think that some of the ones that you all came up with are probably every bit as good as those, and very powerful. Okay, so I don't want to leave the subject of authenticity and self-awareness without taking a moment to talk about emotional intelligence, or EQ. Daniel Goleman is a scholar who's written a lot, and there are, by the way, many of them, and researched a great deal about emotional intelligence. And what he has found in his research, that leaders who have a high level of emotional intelligence will outperform their goals by an average of 20%, while leaders that have low emotional intelligence scores but high innate capabilities and high cognitive abilities will score below their goals on a consistent basis. Emotional intelligence for a leader is that important. What we found is that success in the global arena is predicated on the ability to read and adapt to behavioral cues you get from other cultures. You know, not everybody wants to be led the way you want to be led, and people have their own requirements. The ability to have the emotional intelligence and cognitive ability and social intelligence to adapt to behaviors that are required of you as a leader is very important. What we've also learned is that, and we know, that some people seem to be naturally born with more innate emotional intelligence. And I, for one, from everything I've read, believe that emotional intelligence was really something that was innate. I learned in reading his material and doing the research that so much of emotional intelligence is learnable. And Daniel Goleman has developed a learning model for creating and expanding your own EQ, and we'll talk a little bit about what's in that. But again, what he's proven is that there is a direct link between the success in the business in the business environment for leaders that have significantly more emotional intelligence than others. And he identifies 5 characteristics of emotional intelligence and gaining it. And they begin with the concept of self-awareness. And then, not surprisingly, especially judging by the kinds of comments you shared before, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skill are all a part of that. Okay, so because leaders need to get buy-in from followers, and because great outcomes can only be achieved when followers can identify with the leader's values, leaders need to adapt their message to the followers' values. Your message has to resound well with your followers, because you won't get them to follow you and commit to the goals and objectives that you're putting out without you being able to identify with them and their values. As a result of that, self-awareness and authenticity are not enough. What we need is a global mindset, which takes us to the next gear that we drive on this path. So let's delve a little bit more deeply into the global mindset. In our book, which was written about 9 years ago now, we identified a global mindset as the ability to reflexively integrate deep cultural awareness and intuitively adjust one's style to the requirements of the team without compromising personal values, business values, and goals. So that's what we defined it as, and I think that value, that definition still stands.
And we did get a question about what if you're in an indirect culture but your authentic style is very direct? How do you deal with that? And I think this is an appropriate time to talk about that.
Well, clearly, you have to have the emotional intelligence to recognize that the person you're dealing with won't react well to your direct style. And you need to adjust the message and the way you communicate. You don't have to change your desire to be direct, and you can explain that. You shouldn't change it, but you need to have the sensitivity and the EQ to adjust your message so that the person can deal with the information you're sharing and get the goal that you're after achieving.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So global leaders have to, and this is kind of regardless of whatever else we talk about, have to align people around a common purpose. They need to unite people and get them to buy into a shared set of values, behaviors. A team has to work in a way that other people can develop trust, and we'll talk a lot more about that. Global leaders need to empower people to step up and lead, and we've mentioned that before, and that's important. And they need to be able to serve their organizations. Leading sometimes means serving, to serve their organizations, colleagues, and customers. And there are various types of global leaders that are all successful, but they all develop the sense of serving their organizations. You can't do any of those things without a global mindset. So, there are different expectations that people have of leadership. Some expect leadership to tell them what to do, and others want to be left alone. Some expect leaders to be interested in them and have a personal connection, and some don't look for that. Some look for people to be open to questions. Some want to be left to be independent, and some need direction. So there are a variety of leadership behaviors that are expected, and a global leader with a global mindset will adjust their message to inspire all those people without compromising the goals that they're going after. So how do you get a global mindset? We've identified a series of steps that crystallize the path to a global mindset. And it begins by recognizing your own cultural values and biases. And that's not so different than what we talked about. You can see the integration between this and gaining authenticity and doing your own life map. Recognize that you have cultural values and biases that are right for you and not necessarily right for everybody else. The next step in the process is to therefore appreciate that others have different set of values And there's no point in beating them up to accept yours. It won't work. You've got to address them in a way that will work. And to help you accomplish that, a global leader should learn the ICAM cultural model. And I use ICAM because there are others, but you all have access to this, and we'll look at it a little bit. To look at it as a template for recognizing culturally based behaviors. Because one of the things that we talk about in our cultural model is that it enables you to use recognizable behaviors which are indicative of more deeply held belief systems. And you'll find, of course, this model on Culture Wizard. The next thing gaining a global mindset requires is to learn about the specific cultures of the other countries that you're dealing with. Having a general picture isn't enough. You know, it's a good idea for a global leader to know something about the country, the culture specifically of that country. And that, in today's world, is so easy to get and so interesting to learn about. A global leader then develops strategies to adjust the cultural signals. Look, all of us have different degrees of emotional intelligence and different degrees of reading the cultural signals that we get and being sensitive to the messages that we get. And it's not easy to adjust behaviors instantly. But what we can do is practice. When I encounter this behavior, this is a good course of action for me to follow. That's what developing strategies refers to.
And Mike, this is also another place that Culture Wizard is really helpful, because the country profiles will give you strategies to adjust to certain cultural situations and be very specific.
Exactly. And of course, integrating those and making them your own is the key to this process. And then, of course, a global leader needs to be open to continuous learning and has to look for ways that they can help themselves and their organization capitalize on differences, because there's great value that research has shown in being able to do that. So in that goal, let's quickly take a look at the intercultural model that we have, and you've got access to it, so I'll go very quickly. You know, hierarchy talks about the degree of empowerment you provide as a leader. Group talks about how weight decisions are made in an organization. Of course, there's much more detail on that. Relationship will discuss how trust is established. The communication and cultural value talks about how to deliver messages, how much context to provide to messages. Time talks about how we establish priorities and how important those priorities are vis-a-vis relationships and other items. Control talks about the risk tolerance and a readiness for change. And formality, degree of respect that's necessary, and motivation is very important in terms of how life balance influences people's motivation at work. So here's, by the way, what these values look like on a chart. Okay, so let's talk about how the cultural values then impact leadership. So, of course, the cultural dimension of hierarchy is how leaders engage people, whether they are, you know, and the expectations that people have of leadership. Group talks about how decisions are made in meetings, how goals are reached and established. Relationship will talk about how leaders interact with followers and what are the obligations of leadership in a different culture. Communication, again, as we mentioned, is how you deliver messages as a leader, how much context, how much detail is provided. I can tell you that I have a colleague in Italy, and every time I finish, because I'm a really low context communicator, and no matter how much context I put into a message, every time I finish sharing some information with her, and I'm about to get off the phone, she asks me when I'm going to tell her about what she needs to do and who else is doing what. So we need to develop that communication skill to know how to communicate with people. And of course, control is so important because it talks about whether risk-taking in a leader is an admired trait or one that's looked upon with disdain. Some high-risk cultures are happy for leaders to be risk-takers, and others feel that risk-takers are inappropriate leaders because they put too much in danger. Important stuff.
And we have a question on relationship. And can you explain a little bit more about how leaders interact with followers and their obligations, the obligations of a leader in terms of what that looks like in different cultures?
Well, look, in some cultures, leaders are expected to be colleagues and buddies. People expect to be able to have a first-name basis and a direct communication. In other cultures, leaders don't expect to be challenged, are never asked questions. In some cultures, leaders are a coach, and in other cultures, leaders are directors. No matter what they are, you've got to address followers, you've got to address colleagues and other people in a way that they're comfortable taking the information and staying consistent with yourself. So if you're leading, if you're in a culture, don't expect to become buddies with somebody who can't see buddy as a buddy relationship with a leader. So that's kind of the way I would answer that question. There's a lot more to be said about that, and the culture deals with a lot more deeply in that. Okay, so then I come to this next set of questions to myself. Well, how to use authenticity and a global mindset to lead, which is the next set of questions. And the answer is by building trust and enabling collaboration, which takes us to the third gear of our three-geared engine here, building trust and building collaboration. Look, by definition, global leadership is virtual. We can't see everybody we have to deal with. We don't visit them. We don't see them often enough. We may have relationships with people for years that we've never met. Cultural differences are magnified by the inability to communicate directly face-to-face to see each other, by inability to communicate in a way to see people's body language. So virtual leadership is tough, and it makes the EQ aspect of leadership, the authenticity aspect of leadership, all the more important to build trust in the relationship. And the other thing to keep in mind that some cultures have an easier time dealing virtually with than others do. So let's look at the key ingredient of this, which is trust. And trust, you know, is the glue that makes a team. People won't give you their best thinking, won't risk their best ideas unless they trust, and without that trust, you have very little effective collaboration. So trust is critical to the success of any team, virtual or local in effect. And trust is earned differently from culture to culture. In some cultures, we assume trust. In other cultures, trust has to be earned. But in no case can it be entirely assumed. It has to be nurtured and developed. And we'll talk a little more about that. Trust is easily damaged by cultural misunderstanding. Trust takes a long time to build and not nearly as long to destroy, even unintentionally. So trust needs to be established and maintained with the management leadership process that we provide. In teaching trust, we use the Rayner trust model, which kind of models out the trust behaviors. And it identifies three types of trust. Competency trust, which is the idea of trusting the capabilities of people, acknowledging what they've done, acknowledging their strengths, acknowledging their contributions. Helping people gain more competency is an important part of the competency trust process. In some cultures, because we don't understand somebody's language, we may not think of them as being smart. And you talk about how that impacts. So trust talks about beginning every relationship with the concept that people are trustworthy and building on that trust. Contractual trust is a matter of trusting a character. It's when we can rely on people. When people keep agreements, adhere to schedules, comply with expectations, and look for outcomes where everybody comes away with an effective win. And lastly is communication trust, which is the way you feel comfortable in sharing information freely, respecting the source of the information, give constructive feedback, that's intended to help. And I'm very impressed with the notion of speaking with good purpose, which is that, you want to get feedback and communicate with people in a way that makes everybody feel good about the information you're sharing. So the concept is that trust builds incrementally and reciprocally. One good thing makes you more open to trusting another good thing, and so on, and builds on each other. So contractual trust, if you keep your word and deliver when you're supposed to deliver and keep communicating it effectively, will make people more comfortable. They will become more competent because they're more confident in sharing ideas and more comfortable in trusting it. And communication trust then picks up, and the cycle continues, and it's an incremental building process. We have a trust audit on our virtual teams tool that you can find on the Culture Wizard site. And that is a really cool little instrument which enables a team and a group of colleagues, and you can do it yourself, you don't need colleagues, to kind of answer a set of questions about how well your behavior builds trust. And the questions on the trust audit look something like this. My team recognizes contributions, we talk to each other, we adhere to timelines and schedules, and the answers are yes or no, and it gives you a little printout to tell you how well your team is doing and where it can improve on trust building.
And I have a question from Dan about trust on a team. What if, well, I'll read the question exactly. What would you do if they are making assumptions, if many people or some people on your team are making assumptions about you as a leader, but it's based on their cultural bias of your culture?
Well, there are some great tools and resources that you can use to help people identify who they are and what their cultural and style preferences are. Of course, since you're all users of Culture Wizard, or most of you are, on this site is a wonderful resource, the Team Place tool, which, by the way, is being upgraded now, where people can look at each other's cultural profiles and discuss who they are, why their expectations are the way they are, and that's a great step in building a team. I'd strongly suggest that you do that. In the deeper learning module on trust that we will look at later this year, we'll discuss how you use those tools to help build trust on your team.
And also, in some of the questions and discussion topics, both on the Global Teams tool as well as the Team Place tool, there are questions about what to do about bias among team members and to have discussions about it. So I have another question, too, about virtual teams. Are there cultures that do better virtually than others?
Sure. The low relationship cultures do fine. They don't need to see each other. They don't need to talk much to each other. They just want to get down and doing something and get to business right away. And they do better on virtual teams because they don't need the long-term relationship building that other cultures need, that higher relationship cultures need.
Great, thank you.
And by the way, the other thing is that the cultures that are closest to the leader's culture also approach this with an advantage and sometimes skew a team, and we'll need to talk about how leaders effectively manage that, and we do that in the next component of this course.
Hey, Mike, I have one comment here that I think is relevant to the trust audit from an individual who's actually used it. Sue has told me trust audit is fun. She realized the team in my professional association had some areas to work on. It might not make change happen by itself, but the awareness helped me to cope.
Oh, that's a great comment. Thank you, Sean. Cool. Okay, so what techniques, I'd like to ask you a question, ask you to kind of share with us now quickly in the remaining few minutes. What techniques have you found that are useful in building trust? And the comment we just had was a great one on that subject. Mm-hmm. But let's share some from the folks here.
Okay. I have an interesting one here from Howard, guys. Break bread, eat meals at local times, local cuisine. I think that's lovely.
Yeah, I think so. That's great too. Absolutely. Great thought. Others?
Having some face-to-face meetings.
Great.
Using a webcam so people can see each other.
Oh, that's a great idea, by the way, folks. Using webcams in meetings is a great idea.
There's one here I'd like to mention from Kay, which is demonstrate vulnerability. And I can't help but think of karaoke as one of the best ways to go out with your Asian clients to demonstrate vulnerability.
By the way, that's great. That would be a real challenge for me, but I do think that that's great. Okay.
We've got several here, Mike. Open communication, active listening, delivering on promises, sharing personal experiences.
Great.
There's some great idea there.
Open forums.
Having open forums.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So those are really useful thoughts about this. So as a global leader, how do you create a culture of collaboration? And that is what we're going to be picking up in our next sessions, and we look forward to spending some more time with everybody on that. Before we leave, I just want to again mention to everybody that you can continue this whole learning process on Culture Wizard. I encourage you to download the mobile version of Culture Wizard because it's so cool to have that at your fingertips. I'm in London right now, and I go into meetings here, and even as much as I'm involved in this process, it's always a good idea to look at meeting behaviors in another culture, and you can see that all on the mobile app. I'd like to ask you, as we finish here, to think about the key takeaways that you'd want to take from today's session, and think about how you use them for yourself or how you could share them with others. What are the key things that you've learned and that you want to take away and use with other people? It's really helpful to record those at this point and have them as a carry forward. So I encourage you to do that. And by the way, the white paper on the cultural, on our global leadership model is on your website, so you can download them from your Culture Wizard site, and it's a really good idea. If you're not a Culture Wizard subscriber, and we have some guests and friends with us, just contact us. We'll be happy to share that with you. A recording of the webinar is also going to be on the site, and for our friends and visitors, you're free to contact us for that as well, and we'll be happy to share that with you as well. Before we finish, I just want to see if there are any other questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. We have about just under 5 minutes.
So a question here, Mike. Where do we access the trust assessment on the website?
The trust audit is on the virtual Teams tool, and you'll see it in the left nav on the virtual Teams tool. And the virtual Teams tool is in the Global Teams track, learning track.
And how would you approach a team that's seasoned, that's been together quite a while, and with these new ideas and new techniques?
You will be amazed. That's a great question, by the way, because you will be amazed at how it helps a team that has been working together for a long time to sit down and look at the team place, at their team profile on the Team Place tool. And all of a sudden, we see members of the team saying, oh, so that's why you take so long to get into a subject for somebody that they now discover is high context, a high relationship. And, oh, so that's why when you comment to me and give me feedback, it's so painful. Because people then can kind of joke about it, but can build and strengthen the trust in the team when they understand that these things are not personal, but are culturally based. And it's a sign of a great global leader who can elicit that kind of dialogue amongst the team.
And there was one final question. Where can people access the ICAM cultural model? Do you want to explain where?
And also the white paper.
Well, the white paper is on the right below the fold on your Culture Wizard site.
The homepage.
The homepage of the Culture Wizard site. And the ICAM model is part of, it's taught in the Cultural Awareness Training Tool, and it's reinforced in your Personal Cultural Calculator, and it's also on the smartphone application, so you can get it there as well.
Mike, one last thing. A couple of people have asked about books you'd recommend. I know you mentioned True North earlier on.
Yeah, True North is terrific. We will add to the white paper a bibliography on some other resources and other books on that subject because there's so many terrific scholars. You don't need to read every book that I read on this subject, but there is a great deal of wisdom out there that would be wonderful for you to discover, and we'll post that on the Culture site.
And this was an overview, so each section will have an in-depth bibliography on the 3 different gears that we've talked about.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for participating. Send us your questions, your comments, and we'll look forward to responding and answering them, and look forward to the next session we'll do together. Thank you all.